Good day and welcome to COTK Online. My name is Hannah Nell and I serve as the youth pastor here at Church of the King. Today, I want to invite you to get connected. If it's your first, second, 10th, or 100th time that you are watching COTK Online, I want to invite you to get connected in the spiritual family. You can do that by filling out the Connect card on our website or using the link down in the description box below. Today, I would also like to say thank you so much for your generosity. I want to thank you for sowing your money into God's kingdom and trusting Him and see what He can do globally and locally. Today, you can give by texting the number available on the screen. You can also use our website or our app. Thank you and enjoy today's word.
Welcome to COTK Online. It is great to be with you today. I am excited about today's message. It rather goes in line with the last three messages that I've preached. And I know it hasn't been a titled series, but God's been downloading, I think, something for me at least, and hopefully for you, that can help us as we're following Him. You know, in the first week, which was 3 weeks ago, in Elijah, this is the fourth week. So Elijah, week 1, it's where the going gets tough. And after this great victory, Elijah just ends up down in the dumps from one word, from one person that shouldn't have freaked him out, but it did, because that's how spiritual warfare works. And yet God was with him and brought him on a spiritual and physical journey to the top of Mount Sinai, the mountain of God that's central in biblical history. And it was on that mountaintop that somehow he found a cave. And yet we are called to come out of the cave to seek the Lord and follow Him and the word that He has for us. That was week 1. When the going gets tough, we got to get up out of the cave. The next week was the power of a proclamation with Ezekiel, as God brought him in a vision and showed him a valley of dry bones and said, "Can they live again, Ezekiel?" And Ezekiel wisely said, "You know, Lord." And then God said, "Speak this to these dry bones and they'll come to life." And the fact of the matter for us is that when we see the dead things both in our life and around us and we speak to them, something happens, because when our words align with God's truth and His word to us, life takes place. And I so want that for you. And then last week was the path of a promise. That was King Hezekiah, who was a tremendous, amazing king, and then gets a word at the end of his life. So he thinks it's the end of his life, from Isaiah, the prophet Isaiah, that says, "Put your affairs in order. I know you're sick. You're going to die." And his heart is broken and he weeps bitterly and he prays and says, "God, please, please, you know I love you." And God added 15 years to his life. And we recognize that the process that we have from a word from the Lord is huge. And there's always a picture that God paints, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a practical application to see the process and the promise of God come to reality in our life. But today, we are looking at an amazing story. I love it. It is the story about the priest Jehoiada. And it's really a cool story. We're going to jump in just a moment and just give you a little bit of background. This is out of 2 Chronicles chapter 23. This is in the Old Testament, where we see a series of really terrible kings. And Ahaziah had been on the throne, and then he's killed by Jehu, who God sent to clean house in the nation of Israel and in Judah. And Amaziah is killed, and his mother takes the throne as queen. And her first act as queen mother, she's horrifically terrible. Her very first act is to kill all of her offspring and all of her children's offspring, so that no one can challenge her for the throne. And yet, here's what's amazing, is that we see this one priest, Jehoiada, he protects, he saves, he secrets away Amaziah's son, Joash. And this is where the story picks up. See, that's chapter 22, but we're jumping into chapter 23, and I called it the tipping point, because what we see is the nation of Israel at a tipping point. It's been horrible, terrible, horrific kings. They're worshiping idols. They're sacrificing their children. They're having rituals that are sexual in nature, and it's horrific and horrible. It's one of the low points in the nation of Israel, and yet there's a tipping point coming, and it all begins with Jehoiada, this priest who has dedicated his life to the Lord. And so let's jump in, recognizing that Jehoiada the priest has been secreting away for 7 or 8 years this one young son of the former wicked king, because the queen had tried to kill everybody. Well, here it is, chapter 23, verse 1 of 2nd Chronicles. It says, in the 7th year of Ataiah's reign, that was the queen mother who had killed all of her children and grandchildren, or attempted to, thought she had, didn't realize that Jehoiada had hidden away Joash, the one grandson that lived. In the 7th year of Ataiah's reign, Jehoiada the priest decided to act, and he summoned his courage and made a pact with 5 army commanders. It lists them. And then it says that they all gathered at the temple of God, and they made a solemn pact with Joash, the young king. And Jehoiada said to them, here's the king's son. The time has come for him to reign. So Jehoiada, this priest who's got a heart for God, one of the very few, there's a handful of those who are dedicated to the Lord, but most of the nation of Israel is far from God, and the leadership is horrific. And yet the tipping point begins in verse 1. In the 7th year of Ataiah's reign, Jehoiada the priest decided to act. My heart for you, my heart for our church, for our community of believers, followers of Jesus, is that we recognize that there is a tipping point coming where we see in a dark and broken world around us, the presence and the power of God begin to radically reshape the landscape. But how does that happen? It happens when people who have dedicated their life to the Lord make a decision to act. Let me remind you that you are given the freedom by God to do what you would like to do. People do what they want. I want to remind you of that. Like, I meant to come to church. Okay, that's good. I believe you. But the reality is that sometimes we don't even know that our actions are simply a result of the desires that are deep within inside of us. And sometimes, even though you may have this secret little thing with the Lord, Jehoiada was hiding Joash for 7 years from Ataiah. Got him when he was a 1-year-old little infant. And hid him away so that he would be protected. But there was this secret thing that Jehoiada was doing that was good. And listen, I want that for you. I want you to have a private life with the Lord where you are seeking him, where there is a space and a place that you make in your relationship with him, that you are going deep with him, you are hearing from him. But let me tell you, there will have to come a moment in your life, if you want to see a tipping point of the Lord in your life, you are going to have to get to the place where you choose to act, to do the right thing in the name of the Lord at the time of the Lord. That tipping point's huge. You know, as a kid, one of my favorite games was a game called Don't Spill the Beans. And it was this little cup with a flat disc on top inside with the beans. And you wanted to play the game, you'd take the cup. It was on hinges. There was 2 hinges, so it would swing. You'd take the cup off the hinge thing and just set in it. You'd take the lid off. You'd pour the beans on the ground. You'd put the lid back on. You'd put the empty cup hanging, swinging on this little pivot. And then you'd wait for it to be still. And you could play with a bunch of people, but I played it all the time with my sister. And we'd pick up a bean and we'd put it on the top of that little cup. And the goal was, just what the name of the game was, don't spill the beans. And I'd put a bean and she'd put a bean, and I'd put a bean and she'd put a bean. And the person who spilled the beans lost. And there is a tipping point in our lives when in secret we begin to sow godly seeds seeking him. When we know that there's a purpose and a plan that he has, and its time is coming to fruition. It's us putting those seeds on the don't spill the beans, except the name for us of what we're doing is we want to see the presence of God spill out from overflow in our life. And Jehoiada made a decision not just to secretly do what needed to be done in protecting the place of the Lord in his life and for the community. There came a point and there came a time, and I believe it was God ordained, he had to decide to act. And I want that for you. I don't want your faith to be so private for so long that there's never any outward application of what God's doing on the inside of you. You have to decide to act, because when you decide to act on what God has been doing inside of you in those private, secret moments, that you're going, Lord, I want that. You're going to have to act. And that can be hard and that can be scary. As we look at Jehoiada's plan to put Joash on the throne and depose the wicked queen mother Ataiah, he had to act. Look, I'm going to read it. Jehoiada the priest decided to act. And then there's a period there. He decided to act because your decision to do what God's called you to do must stand alone. I want you to understand that. Your decision must be a godly decision. It must be Holy Spirit inspired, but you will have to choose to act. That is standalone. Why am I saying that? Because the truth of the matter is that when we know the call of God that's on our life, we have to choose to act, but our feelings will often be in direct contradiction to what we know God is calling us to do. Because it's scary, because it's risky, because it's going to change everything. All of these were true for Jehoiada. He knew that he was going to have to confront ultimately a wicked queen who was doing everything she could to retain the throne, to retain power. This is a picture of the spiritual battle that rages all around us and in us. And Jehoiada was having to make the choice at the proper time. It had been 7 years. He's hiding the true king. And now he's saying, we have to put this king in the place where he needs to be. By default, it means that the queen that's on the throne has to come off. And he decides to act. That is scary. He knew the risks. He knew the dangers. He had to be scared. How do I know that? Because here's the very next sentence that we see continuing on in verse 1 of 2 Chronicles 23. Jehoiada the priest decided to act, period. We have to decide to act. But look at the next thing. He summoned his courage. He summoned his courage. Listen, if you want to see the tipping point of God in your life, where you see him begin to move in a practical sense in you, but then through you, you first have to decide to act. But here's the second thing. You are going to have to summon your courage. We see this all throughout the Bible. We see 1 Samuel chapter 30 when David comes back after he'd come back and to his hometown. It's a long story. Look it up, read it. But it's a simple one. He and all of his fighting men had come back to their town that they had left, Ziklag. And raiders had come in and destroyed it and taken all of the women and all of the children. And they were all super depressed. His men were so mad at him that they had been gone when this happened. They were talking about stoning him and killing him. And the Bible says this. It says, and David strengthened himself in the Lord. It's the same word that we see here in 2 Chronicles 23:1, where Jehoiada summoned his courage. It's actually the Hebrew form. We've anglicized it. It means Ezekiel. It means Ezekiel. And it's the name of the prophet who spoke and brought life, but they've turned it into a verb. And so he's got to Ezekiel himself. He has to strengthen himself. He has to summon up his courage. And let me just tell you, this is so true for us. If we're going to see God move in us and specifically through us to see the world around us come to a revelation, into a place where the evil king or queen, the evil ruler of what's around us is deposed, we have to decide to act first, but we have to summon our courage. There is something that has to happen inside of us where we have spent enough time in the presence of the Lord and we recognize his strength, that his strength becomes our strength. And in those moments that we are aligning with the truth of we know who God is, so we know who we are, and we recognize the call of God on our life to make a difference in the world around us. And so we decide to act in spite of our feelings. And then even though our feelings may be saying, what are you doing? This is crazy. We could all die. This could change everything. Yes, it can, for the purpose and the plan of God. But we have to choose to strengthen ourselves, to summon up our courage. What does that mean? That means, Lord, I know that this is a scary thing, but I'm going to trust you in it because I know it's your purpose. Courage is not the absence of fear. It's the determination to do what needs to be done for a good outcome in spite of how you feel, because you may be very scared. But my prayer for you is that when you know that God's calling you to act, you can stand in faith, that you say, Lord, I know your purpose and your plan is bigger than the fear that I'm feeling inside, the scaredness inside of me that says, what if, what about, how does this happen? That tipping point, you got to choose to act. You have to summon that courage and speak in faith what you know God is calling you to do. Here's the third thing. Jehoiada the priest first decided to act, period. And then two things happened simultaneously because there's a conjunction between this. Jehoiada the priest decided to act, period. That's the first thing. The second thing, he summoned his courage. That's point two. Here's point three, and here's the conjunction. He summons his courage and made a pact with 5 army commanders. Because here's the third thing. We need to make a pact with trusted believers. We need to make a pact with other people that have a heart for the Lord and have a heart to see the rightful king put in the place where he can reign and rule. You really can't separate the two, I don't believe, that courage, or in some translations, specifically in 1 Samuel 36, where David is at Ziklag, his own men want to kill him because all of their wives and children have been taken captive. It says he strengthened himself. Some translations translate it because of the context, encouraged himself in the Lord. And there comes a point where we have to not just act, we have to summon that courage. We have to strengthen ourselves, but we also are called to make a pact with other believers. So in 2 Kings 11, we see another version of this story. It's a more abbreviated version than we see in Chronicles, but it chronicles the same thing. In 2 Kings 11:17 says, "Then Jehoiada made a covenant between the Lord and the king and the people that they would be the Lord's people." In other words, there's this triangulation and what we know God's calling us to in acting in courage and in summoning and acting and then in summoning our own courage. It's the covenant or the pact that we make with other believers so that we can be in the place where we can see the purpose of God take place. I want you to know, if you're going to see a tipping point in your own life where you are watching God actively move in you and through you, you have to choose to act. May we never forget that one of the fruit of the Spirit is self-control. And where the enemy comes to keep us in a place of complacency, so we don't ever act, or when we decide to act, he whispers fear. We have to have the self-control to not just do what needs to be done, but to take every thought captive to the obedience of Christ. I will be obedient, and I will not allow the fear of the enemy who's whispering in my ear to keep me from doing what God's called me to do. And then, we can go look at Ecclesiastes chapter 4, where it talks about how when you work together with other believers, something happens. When you're walking side by side, you're going to be able to defeat somebody because you can stand back to back. And 3 people, man, wow. I want you to understand that if you want to see God move, like Jehoiada, the priest who had dedicated himself to the Lord, he had to choose to act. He had to strengthen and summon his own courage, strengthen himself, summon that courage. But he also made that pact, that covenant with the people around him that he trusted. You got to decide to act. You got to summon your courage. You got to make a pact with trusted believers. They all gathered at the temple of God, where they made a solemn pact with Joash, the young king. And what is the pact you're making with other believers? Is you, is them, and with the rightful king. Let's read on. Jehoiada said to them, "Here's the king's son. The time has come for him to reign. The Lord has promised that a descendant of David will be our king, and this is what you must do. When the priests and the Levites come on duty on the Sabbath, a third of you will serve as gatekeepers. Another third will go to the palace. The final third will go to the foundation gate. Everyone else should stay in the courtyards of the Lord's temple. Remember, only the priests and the Levites on duty may enter the temple of the Lord." Verse 7, "You Levites form a bodyguard around the king. Keep your weapons in hand. Kill anyone who tries to enter the temple. Stay with the king wherever he goes." So the Levites and all of the people of Judah did everything as Jehoiada the priest ordered. Remember, he's trying to depose the wicked king. Jehoiada is trying to depose the wicked queen and put the rightful king on the throne. The commanders took charge of the men reporting for duty that Sabbath, as well as those who were going off duty, and Jehoiada the priest didn't let anyone go home after their shift ended. Then Jehoiada supplied the commanders with the spears and the large and small shields that had once belonged to King David and were stored in the temple of God. He stationed all the people around the king with their weapons ready. They formed a line from the south side of the temple, around the north side, and all around the altar. Because here's the fourth thing you got to know. If you want to see God move in a big way in you and through you, you got to decide to act. You got to summon your courage. You got to make a pact with trusted believers. But here's the fourth thing. You have to protect the plan of God in your life. And you need to protect and work together, protect the people of God in your life. Jehoiada knew that it was his call, it was his purpose to depose the wicked king. Jehoiada knew that it was his call, it was his purpose to depose the wicked queen and put the righteous king on the throne. Though he was simply an 8-year-old boy, he knew God's call on his life. That's why he acted. It was scary, so he had to summon his courage. He made a pact with other believers because he knew that what he was called to do could never be done alone. That's a truth that we all have to recognize. But then, you got to protect the plan and the people of God in your life. That's what he does. He's like, you go here, you go here. We're going to make sure that the rightful king is protected and the plan that God has given me works because we're all working together. Remember, what God gives you is never just for you. In fact, it's mainly for other people. And we are called as believers to work together to see the purpose and the plan of God come and be a reality in our lives, but in all the world around us. That's why Jerusalem, which is where they are, it's called a place of prayer for all nations because God has a heart for all of the world. But if we're not doing a good job in hearing from him, stepping out and acting, summoning our courage, making a pact with other believers, if we're not protecting the plan and the people that he's put in our hearts and right around us, the world's never going to be changed for all nations coming to him because we're not willing to trust him in that one moment. Protect the plan of God in your life. And here's the last thing. You have to choose to put the rightful king on the throne. Look at verse 11. Then Jehoiada and his sons brought out Joash, the king's son, and they placed the crown on his head, and they presented him with a copy of God's laws, and they anointed him and proclaimed him king. And everyone shouted, "Long live the king." And there's this moment where it's the fifth thing. If we're going to see the tipping point, we got to act. We got to summon our courage. We got to make a pact with other believers. We got to protect the plan of God in our life. But we have to ultimately put the rightful king on the throne. Here's the byproduct, because it's like there's this fight at some point, because he put the rightful king on the throne, but guess what? The queen was still alive. Anytime we put the rightful king on the throne of our life, because now I'm going to personalize this whole thing for every believer, I've got to step out in obedience and trust God. I've got to not disregard my feelings, but speak to the truth of God as he is speaking to me, and I'm strengthening myself in him. I'm summoning my courage. I'm not the source of that courage. He is. That I'm walking together with other believers so that we know that God has a plan for us together to see his kingdom come and his will be done. But we all must put the rightful king on the throne. You know what that means? I mean, they put Joash on the throne. He's an 8-year-old boy, but he's the proper heir to the throne. And he is put on that throne, and everybody says, "Long live the king." He's on the throne. But there's still one more thing that's got to happen. The queen got to die. I love the next portion of it. I'm not going to read all of it, but she hears what's going on, and she freaks out, and she runs into where they are, and she yells, "Treason! Treason!" And for me, in my imaginative brain, I can see that whole scene, and I don't know why, but I think the Princess Bride, I don't know why, but like, "Treason! Treason!" It says, "Then Jehoiada the priest ordered the commanders who were in charge of the troops, 'Take her to the soldiers in front of the temple. Kill anyone who tries to rescue her.' And they put this wicked, wicked queen who had killed her own grandchildren, they put her to death. To have the rightful king king on the throne of our lives, in our heart, and in our church, means that the old king gotta die, and the rightful king is on the throne. It's Jesus. All of this began in this very dark time in Israel's history. It began because Jehoiada had dedicated himself to the Lord. Listen, I want you to get to the place where you are acting on what you know the Lord has spoken to you, and you are strengthening yourself in His word despite the feelings of an apprehension you may have, that you are walking hand in hand with other believers and protecting what God is doing in your life and the plan that He has for you and everybody together, that you are putting the rightful king on the throne. But it begins with you dedicating your life to the Lord like Jehoiada did. This whole tipping point, not just for Jehoiada or for Joash, the young king, it began with Jehoiada dedicating himself to the Lord. And the call for you and for me is that we have to say yes to God's call on our life and dedicate ourselves to the Lord. And when we do that, and we partner it with obedience and action, there's a tipping point in the world around us. But maybe I'm talking to you, and the tipping point needs to take place in your heart. The enemy's been sowing seeds of lies, like don't spill the beans, but that needs to be tipped over so that God's purpose can be built inside of you. If that's you, just pray with me. Say, "Dear Jesus, I choose you. I dedicate my life to you. Jesus, I believe you died on that cross for me to wash away my sins. I dedicate my life to you. I surrender to you. I receive your forgiveness. Use me. In Jesus' name, amen." Listen, if that's you and you prayed that prayer and you meant it, the first step is be baptized. The second one, connect with godly believers. I want to connect you with people that can help you grow, with resources and relationships that can help you grow. Click on the link in the chat underneath. Reach out on social media, on our website. We love you and hope to hear from you. God bless, and may we all see God's kingdom become a reality in our life and our world around us. God bless.